Thank you all for joining us today. We are going to be focusing on the eastern hemlock tree and then the invasive insect, the hemlock woolly adelgid, that's unfortunately impacting a lot of our hemlocks across the eastern US. So let's go ahead and get started. So this is part of our Trees Under Threat Zoom series. The recordings are going to be posted usually in the afternoon after the class, so they'll be available on the Hopkins County Extension Horticulture YouTube channel. Next month, we're going to end the series talking about a big one. Next month, we're going to talk about the American chestnut, chestnut blight, and what are some of the breeding programs, research being done to try to bring the American chestnut back from extinction, essentially. So that's going to be our last one. I will say after this series, so for October, November, and December, we're going to focus entirely on invasive plant species that are found in Kentucky. So anything from kudzu to bush honeysuckle to Japanese stilt grass. We're going to cover a wide range of different invasive species. So just kind of be on the lookout. We're finalizing the flyers for that class. All right, so let's go ahead and start with what is Eastern hemlock or Tsuga canadensis. So this is in the Pinaceae family. So this is in our pine family. It is a woody needled evergreen, as you can clearly see by the picture. Generally, it has more of a conical shape to it with some drooping branches. And it can grow generally about 70 feet tall. Now, with the eastern hemlock, it does require certain conditions for it to thrive, or else it wouldn't be very long lived in the right landscape. It really likes to have moist soil, likes to be in moist soil conditions, although they do need to be somewhat well draining and also somewhat acidic. Generally, eastern hemlock tends to do better in cooler summers. And so what you'll find when we talk about the distribution of eastern hemlock, you'll kind of see that in more of the mountainous regions of the Appalachian Mountains, where it's going to thrive a little bit better, kind of under those somewhat cooler summer conditions. This is not a plant that does well with drought. It's going to struggle in drought conditions. If you look closely at the bark is going to be anywhere between a reddish brown to grayish brown color, just kind of depending on its maturity age. It's going to be more scaly or ridged with irregular fissures. Now, if you look very closely at the needles are very glossy in appearance, and they kind of grow along these flat planes. And they're usually, if you look really closely, they're kind of spirally arranged. And then if you kind of glimpse the undersides, they're going to be a little bit paler, have these paler bands. Now, these do produce cones. So we have kind of what are called our pollen cones and then our seed cones. So as you can imagine, our pollen cones are kind of more of our male reproductive cones, and then the seed cones are our female reproductive cones. Generally, they're going to start producing these cones about 15 years of age. The seed cones, which is kind of what we typically view, you can see in this top picture here, they're going to be brown when they're mature and green when they're young. They have a closed scale system that will open when it's ready to release its seeds. And generally, these are going to hang from the tips of the different twigs. Now, you could also see the pollen cones found in groupings near the tips of the branches, but a lot of times people kind of miss that. But of course, the pollen is going to be wind-bound and is going to fertilize those seed cones. So importance, I kind of combine economic and ethnobotanical just because you don't really think of it much as like a timber tree, of course, compared to a lot of our other tree species that we focused in on. So I kind of want to talk about it from an ethnobotanical standpoint too. So a lot of our indigenous Native American populations actually use the cambium tissue layer to help in used in different breads and soups. The leaves themselves, the needle-like leaves, were used as a tea because they're actually very high in vitamin C. And then the bark, from an economic standpoint, was commonly used as a tannin for leather production as well. Now, kind of moving aside from that, let's focus more on the ecological importance because this does have quite a bit of ecological importance. This serves as a great shelter tree for different wildlife, small mammals, birds, amphibians. The seeds are eaten quite often by some of these smaller mammals, and plenty of birds will consume the seeds. Ruffed grouse will eat the buds of the tree, and then deer commonly are going to browse the twigs and the foliage and things like that. Now, I kind of do want to draw your attention to the picture of the bird. Um, so the bird is known as a red crossbill. And what's so important about this is red crossbills are found in coniferous woodlands. So coniferous woodlands across the United States. And so they rely very heavily on the seeds as part of their food source. And so something that we're going to be talking about today with, unfortunately, the decline of eastern hemlocks, it's resulting in bird species such as the crossbill, where if you're eliminating so much of the coniferous forests, then they're going to have to go elsewhere. Or you could start to even potentially see a population decline because their own habitat and their food source is destroyed essentially. So, you know, something that we've kind of talked about as well with previous classes is it kind of creates this domino effect, right? Where if you have one species that goes in decline, then you have another species that relies on that may also go into decline, and then it kind of upsets that balance. So this is kind of one of those examples here. So this is the distribution of the eastern hemlock. Now, I know we're out here in West Kentucky. We don't really have eastern hemlock here in West Kentucky. We're looking at that more out in eastern Kentucky. Again, very common around along the Appalachian mountain chain. With that said, though, we do have quite a bit of hemlock cultivars that are used for ornamental purposes in our landscape that do fairly well in our climate. I had a hemlock cultivar for many years until unfortunately it was like sitting right on a gas line and had to be removed. But you know, that one did pretty well here. And so unfortunately, with the Adelgid, it could impact even ornamental plantings of hemlock. So that's just something to keep in mind. Now, again, this kind of insect, we'll talk about its distribution is kind of more confined, again, to that Appalachian mountain range. But this is certainly, you know, something that is still impacting a good portion of the state. And it's good to just kind of have this understanding and knowledge of it. So let's talk about the insect itself. So the hemlock woolly adelgid, it is an invasive insect species. It was introduced to the eastern US in the 1950s. It was originally found in Richmond, Virginia. It's native to Asia. And I'm sure you all especially when we talk about some of these invasive pests, you kind of notice this trend where a lot of them are coming from Asia. And especially with a lot of the trade, manufacturing industry that comes from overseas, unfortunately, it's very possible for these insects to tag along too. And why these insects do so well here in our Kentucky climate is a lot of times the parts of Asia they're coming from are more temperate regions, temperate to subtropical, where they're going to be they're going to be coming from similar conditions and then thriving in our environmental conditions even more so than at home because a lot of times they don't have like a natural predator here, like they did back at home, that would keep their population in check. And so as a result, when they're here in Kentucky or any part of the US, they can get out of control and their populations can explode because there's nothing to kind of keep them at bay. So, unfortunately, that's just the rundown that we see with a lot of these invasive insect species from Asia. Now, specifically in Kentucky, it was found in about 2006 was when we noticed that the woolly adelgid had come here. This is a sap feeder type insect. Now, a lot of times we don't really get a good close up of the insect unless you're actually really looking for it or depending on what part of the life cycle it's in. But what we do typically notice is its protective coating. So it can hide and be protected by predators, be protected by the weather, extreme temperatures, things like that, in these white woolly masses. They look like cotton balls, honestly. And we find these typically along the bases of the needles of the eastern hemlock. And the woolly adelgid can impact both eastern and Carolina hemlocks in both eastern forests and in those ornamental plantings. So if you have cultivated varieties of these eastern and Carolina hemlocks, potentially they could also be susceptible as well. Now, unfortunately, with the adelgid, like other sap feeders, they consume a lot of starch and sugars from the vascular tissue of the tree. And so they can cause quite a bit of damage that we're going to talk about. And unfortunately, these are insects that can be easily transported. They can easily be blown by the wind. They could be carried by birds and wildlife. And so it's very easy for them to go from tree to tree. So to give you a rough idea of its life cycle, technically, the woolly adelgid has 2 generations a year. And unfortunately, they're very similar to aphids, where aphids um, generally, these are female, okay? So the woolly adelgids and the aphids, we think of females that are able to asexually reproduce. So one female does not need a mate in order to produce eggs. And in fact, female woolly adelgids can produce up to 300 eggs. So it's pretty significant. Now, there is a sexual phase of the woolly adelgid, but generally that requires like another host of a Japanese spruce for that to do it. So we're not kind of really even examining that part of its life cycle. We're just going to focus on kind of the asexual life cycle of the females laying the eggs. And so oftentimes the females will lay the eggs in early spring. Okay. And so they're going to hatch and you're going to have the nymph stage. And the nymphs tend to settle near the base of the needles where they're essentially sucking from the twigs the sap. Okay. So they're going to be feasting on that sap. Now, after a few weeks, those nymphs are going to mature. And then they're going to be capable of producing more eggs. So by this point, this is looking into late spring. Those eggs are going to hatch and emerge. And then you get the new nymphs. In this case, you get this crawler stage where they're mobile. Now, with this second generation, however, the crawlers are going to actually be inactive, kind of borderline dormant during the summer months. They're really not going to be doing a whole lot during the hot summer months, okay? They're going to usually kind of stay in this kind of, again, inactive state, and then they're going to resume feeding in about September, give or take, depending on where you are. And then they're capable of overwintering. Unfortunately, they're capable of overwintering on the branches and the twigs because they are protected by that woolly material. So, unfortunately, it's not one of those things where, certain invasive insects can get killed off during the extreme winter temperatures. That's not so much the case here. These adelgids can survive over the winter and then wreak havoc the following year. So that's what makes this very difficult is not only is it two generations, but the ability for the females to produce a few hundred eggs in a given time is just, it's pretty substantial. So, with the adelgid feeding on the trees, what are some of the damage that we're going to notice? So you're going to see reduced shoot growth initially. The foliage is going to look kind of more of a dull color. It's going to become more of this grayish green, not as vibrant. You may see needles start to drop. You may see the crown of the tree start to thin out. You may start to see the tips of the branches start to die back. And this may be something you don't notice initially, but over the span of a few years, you start to see it become worse and worse. And unfortunately, once the infestation gets severe enough, it's going to lead to eventual tree death. And typically with the adelgid, it's going to kill trees in about 4 to 10 years. And what happens is, too, it's not just the adelgid that's really causing the death. A lot of times their feeding is going to severely weaken the trees where it can leave them susceptible to other issues, so other pests or other diseases. That's the thing when we talk about stressed trees. They're just like people. When a person's stressed, don't we tend to get sick a little bit easier? Well, it's kind of the same thing. When a tree is stressed, it tends to be more susceptible to other problems. So, a lot of times, other factors also at the end tend to result in the demise of the tree. And unfortunately, this is going to impact about 80% of trees infected. Okay, so you don't have a whole lot of resistance. Okay, you don't have a whole lot of trees that can kind of, bear that are kind of more resilient to these insects that can kind of fight them off, if you will, or put up with their damage. Um, this picture that you see here from the Forest Service, um, this is very much a tried and true picture of what we're looking at with hemlock damage and dieback. Unfortunately, you see almost these skeletons of these trees in the landscape. And I'm originally from South Central Pennsylvania, from the Appalachian Mountains there, and very commonly we'd go down to Virginia, West Virginia, into Maryland area, and go hiking. And, unfortunately, I've noticed this since, I know started noticing this, say, 20 years ago. You know what I mean? It's been around a while, but we really see the devastating effects. And so kind of if you go through some of the Appalachian mountain range and you go through some of these areas or you're hiking some of these areas, you may unfortunately see these skeletons of what used to be these hemlock trees. And the hemlock trees that are still around, that I see that are still around whenever I still visit, tend to be, stressed or pretty heavily damaged. So it's it's quite a depressing and morbid picture whenever you start to see this um, over the full scale, the full scope of an area. And let me kind of just go ahead and show you this distribution map where you can see this. So you notice, so the green part, kind of what we were showing earlier, is the range of the eastern hemlock. And then, of course, you get into the yellow, orange, and brown, where the Adelgid's been found, and then, kind of what year it was found. And so you kind of see that trend where it's unfortunately going up that Appalachian mountain range, impacting Kentucky, Tennessee, West Virginia, Virginia. I mean, all those areas up into New England. So it's pretty substantial. It's pretty well established, unfortunately. And to kind of give you an idea of how far does an infestation go per year? Well, scientists estimate that it can expand about 15 miles per year, 15 miles. So, unfortunately, this insect, again, because it's so easily transported by wind or animals, can really expand its range pretty quickly. Um, so that's definitely an issue. And again, if you ever are traveling or you're living in the Appalachian region, you probably have seen this for yourself, unfortunately. Let me talk a little bit about management before we get into kind of the environmental impact of declining hemlocks. Um, I will say a lot of this, again, kind of where we are, we're not really going to have to worry with this. But if you are kind of in a region where you see this, a lot of times it's a good idea to just go ahead and contact a certified arborist, because they would have some of these treatment options. And it would probably be better for them to do it as opposed to you trying to do it yourself. But one of the options is, especially I would say if you have a smaller tree, it's a little bit more difficult with pretty big mature trees, is you can spray the foliage with an insecticidal soap or horticultural oil, at the proper life cycle of the adelgid that we'll talk about. Or you could also use what we call a systemic insecticide that basically is going to move with the tree sap into the tree, and it's going to be consumed by the adelgids as they eat and then kill them off. Now, we'll kind of go into more specifics here in a second with these two methods. But I will say, the earlier you can scout and monitor your tree, the better. Early detection helps to treat these isolated infestations, and it's easier to control when it's at the early stages versus kind of already really infesting the tree. I will say, kind of another method was the use of biologic controls, such as releasing the imported lady beetle or kind of ladybug that we think of, that would feed on the adelgids to try to have some control, but just really, with how expansive it was, it really unfortunately didn't have as much of the impact as we wanted. But typically, that's something that scientists also think about: is there some other insect that could feed on this one that could serve as a natural predator? And so lady beetles was one of those that was looked at originally. So let's talk about the sprays. Insecticidal soaps, horticultural oils are very widely available in the trade. Many of them may even be certified organic as well. Um, Basically, it's a contact insecticide where you're going to cover the insects, you're going to spray the foliage, it's going to kill the insects right there on contact. Um, Most of the time, because they can hide in nooks and crannies of the tree, you're probably going to have to do multiple applications to try to get as much of the insect as possible. Again, this is going to be easier to do on small trees where you have just like a pump up garden sprayer that'll work. But for larger trees, you may need some kind of power sprayer. And at that point, again, probably need some kind of a certified arborist to come in and take care of that. Um, Applications are really going to be only effective during two windows of opportunity, okay? Because if they're hiding in that protective coating that they have, then it's not going to be very effective. So um, you have two windows of opportunity here to spray. One, when the eggs hatch and you get those crawlers, you get kind of the younger stage of the insect where they're still mobile, they're out of that coating. Typically, that's March through April. And again, month is the time of the year, the month is going to depend on where you are in the United States, of course. But then the second time is going to be September into October. So you're going to be looking at a late summer into fall time as well to spray. As I always say in these, always read the product label, always read the instructions and follow all the instructions on the label to make sure you're doing everything you're supposed to. Um, but just something to keep in mind. And insecticidal soaps are usually very effective on other insect species. Like we commonly use insecticidal soaps on other sap feeders like aphids and things like that as well. So it can be beneficial in trying to kill off the Adelgid. Systemic treatments. So generally systemic treatments are going to contain the active ingredient imidacloprid. It's used as a soil drench or as an injection. The reason being it's very soluble in water. It can be easily taken up by the tree roots, moved into the sap where these insects are feeding, and then kill them off. Generally, you have two opportunities to apply it while the insects are feeding, again in the spring and then the fall, because during the actual summer months, again, these insects are usually inactive and not feeding. There's a few ways that you can use this insecticide. You can do a soil drench, which you apply evenly over the soil surface with a series of small holes that are spaced out around the base of the tree. And that helps move the insecticide down into the soil. You can do a soil injection where it's injected several inches in the soil surface with an injector. It allows good placement of the insecticides and proper uptake by the roots. Or third, you could use a trunk injection. Not typically something we would really recommend just because you're basically drilling holes into the tree. If the tree is already stressed out, you could be kind of injuring the tree further, causing it additional stress. So not really, something we would necessarily recommend. But again, honestly, a lot of these options overall, you don't need to be doing this yourself. Contact a certified arborist in your area to take care of this so that you know it's being done properly. So kind of moving on from that, what are some other things you could do? So say you're taking these measures, you're monitoring your healthy hemlocks to make sure that they're Adelgid free, or you're spraying properly to kind of control populations to keep the trees less stressed and less prone to injury. What are some other things you can do to help your trees? And I will say in general, these are good things to keep in mind just for any tree that might have any kind of disease or insect that could be plaguing it. First off is water the trees during dry periods. Especially hemlocks, but other trees as well, where they don't tolerate drought. Water them good, even if it's a mature tree, even if it's established. If we unfortunately in West Kentucky, where we had a very dry spring last fall, we went 30 plus days without rain. That can have a significant cause significant stress on trees. So water them well when we have those dry periods. Also, if you see any dead or dying limbs, that's always a good sanitation protocol, with just cleaning the tree up. Make sure you're sanitizing your tools after you remove them, just in case there's any pest or disease that could be lingering on it. Don't fertilize. I mean, and this is the case again for not just for eastern hemlock and being plagued by the woolly adelgid. A lot of people see a stressed tree and they think immediately they should fertilize it. Usually, over fertilization causes more harm than good. Don't fertilize. Honestly, once trees are really well established in the landscape, they're never going to need fertilizer, hardly ever. Are you going to ever have issues with like nutrient deficiency there? So if the tree looks stressed, just don't be tempted to fertilize it, because a lot of times more of that nutrient uptake can kind of be a little bit more desirable to these bugs. So and unfortunately with the adelgids, they tend to thrive more on fertilized trees. So that applies to if you have hemlocks in your landscape, and even say your trees out in your landscape, out in your lawn, and then you're fertilizing your lawn, the tree could be taking up some of that fertilizer too. So you need to keep all that in mind. Now, this is one that's kind of like, what? But avoid placing bird feeders near hemlocks. With that being because birds easily transport the adelgid by accident, of course. And so it may be a good idea to kind of leave your bird feeders like on the other side of your property, or near a different grouping of trees, just because you don't want to accidentally have the birds transport the adelgids to more hemlocks that are nearby. And let me tell you, like, when I had a cultivated variety of hemlock, it's easier said than done. I didn't even have a bird feeder there, but birds just tend to flock to hemlocks. They just shelter. They enjoy that shelter there. I would kind of watch them from my window, and see so many birds kind of flying in and out of hemlocks. So it's definitely hard to kind of keep the birds away. So impact and future, what are we looking at here? Well, it's kind of a little bit of a dire outlook, right? Um, Unfortunately, as we saw from that distribution map, it's found in over half of the hemlock range. It hasn't really made it to parts of Canada yet, where we still have eastern hemlocks there. But unfortunately, um, it's killed about 90% of hemlocks in the Shenandoah National Park. So I don't know if many of you kind of go down there. We used to always go there on vacation during the summer months, growing up. And unfortunately, most of the hemlocks there have perished. And again, kind of based on the picture you see here, you just see those skeletons of what once were these hemlock trees. And it's very, very sad. What happens when you have significant hemlock death like this is you get a shift in forest species. Again, when you have one plant species in decline, it can kind of upset the forest composition. So other tree species would take over in its place. Um, Other animal species may take over, or others may decline as a result because they needed the hemlock to survive. Especially with hemlocks liking more of those moist conditions, you get into issues with watersheds and riparian zones along those areas, where when you no longer have the hemlocks that were helping with nutrient cycling and leaching with where that water is, then you get kind of an upset of balance there in more of those aquatic or subaquatic environments. So that could impact even some of the organisms that are found in those streams. So again, it's creating this domino effect, and it's changing the whole ecosystem when you have this decline like this. And as I mentioned earlier, you get a loss of wildlife, birds, especially birds that heavily rely on the seeds that only feed on coniferous trees. And then you eliminate all of these hemlocks, they're going to have to either move elsewhere to survive, or their population is going to just decline all around. So, again, that's something that we're looking at too. Now, kind of with this, what's happening is very similar to what we're going to talk about with the American chestnut. There's definitely research being done on what are some hemlock cultivars, hemlock varieties that are going to be more resistant to the woolly adelgid, that can kind of, again, be more resilient to it, be able to fight it off a little bit better, not be as prone to injury and death. So, there's definitely plant breeding programs that are in place trying to see what can be done. And then if you have some of these successful varieties that can withstand the woolly adelgid, then maybe they could be potentially introduced back into the landscape. Um, so that's something that scientists are looking at. But then also, what are some other techniques? What are some biological controls? What are some chemical controls to try to reduce the overall population of this invasive insect species? So, what are some other ways that we can control it and reduce its spread? Unfortunately, it's just like things like emerald ash borer. It's getting into things like spotted lanternfly. We're just trying to find different ways to keep these insects at bay and try to control them as best as we can. But with that, we need the resources, and we need the proper management and education to be able to do that. Um, so, that's kind of what we're looking at here. Um, Again, I will say, like, even though we are not seeing this in West Kentucky, this is still something that is devastating the eastern half of our state, that we see in the whole Appalachian Mountain Range. And for any of us that really care about our ecosystems, our animal species, we want to care about trying to control this insect to protect any remaining hemlocks that are out there, or to protect the locations that have not been impacted yet. So that's kind of, again, the focus of this series is to kind of raise awareness for this, and just help us kind of better understand what's going on. So with that, I'm going to finish up for the day.